What's up, YouTube? Ryan Panny here. Hope you guys are doing reasonably well. We're going to talk essential metal today. First one of these I've done in a while, actually. Testament's classic 8th record, The Gathering. So Testament, almost 100% of the time, come up in that who's the next big four debate that thrash metal fans love to have. And I have spoken extensively on how much I dislike that conversation, but I digress. The big four of thrash metal being generally agreed upon as Anthrax, Slayer, Megadeth, Metallica, and then the next conversation being, okay, well, who would be the next big four? Those next few spots are always heavily debated, as is the question of, well, do any of these other bands technically deserve to be in that original group? The answer is no, they don't. Anthrax, Megadeth, Metallica, Slayer have way outsold and are incredibly more influential than any other thrash bands. I'm sorry. And they're not even my favorites either, with the exception of Megadeth. So Testament did come from the Bay Area, which is the birthplace of thrash metal, but since they didn't technically come out until 1987, they were part of what was known at the time as the second wave of thrash metal. And something people definitely forget about Testament is they were very much looked down upon by elitists and by zine readers who were there from day one in the early 80s. I remember reading this old magazine interview with Megadeth and Slayer when they were promoting their 1991 Clash of the Titans tour, which of course is a legendary tour, and like a good chunk of the interview was them particularly bashing Testament, calling them Metallica ripoffs and all sorts of stuff. So people kind of forget that Testament to purists weren't necessarily meeting some arbitrary expectation. But then the mid-90s rolls around, the thrash apocalypse hits, grunge and nu metal take over the airwaves, and the entire landscape changes. You have most major thrash metal acts, Anthrax, Metallica, Megadeth, pretty much jumping ship altogether and experimenting with completely different sounds, mostly in the alternative universe. Then you have bands like Slayer and Overkill who basically just chugged along and tweaked their sound in not necessarily major ways, but just enough to survive that little recession. And then way over in this corner, you have Testament, who just said, fuck this, we're gonna get heavier. Fuck this. And you listen to 1994's Low record, which, no pun intended, is definitely a low commercial point in the band's catalog, and that's what you hear. You hear a band getting heavier. Critically speaking, Low got quite a mixed reception when it came out, but I would argue that it really helped Testament A, distinguish themselves, and B, maintain their metal credibility at a time when metal credibility was so disposable to so many of their peers. And history has looked back quite more fondly on Low, and I would argue the same for 1997's Demonic, which got even more aggressive. And this all helped pave the way for, just a few years later, one of the true unsung gems of the thrash metal genre, The Gathering. And the only reason that every person ever does not call it that, what it is, which is one of the unsung gems of the genre, is because it came out in June 1999, at the very height of nu metal. And that's enough to keep it out of most conversations, just that weird timing. When people talk about thrash classics, underground or mainstream, they typically look to the late 1980s, early 1990s, and they are seriously misled to exclude The Gathering from any of those conversations. Of course, Testament fans know what's up. You probably know what's up because you're already watching this video, but just in case you don't, that's what this video is for. First of all, before we even get into the music here, we've got to talk about the personnel involved, because Testament did undergo significant lineup changes in the 90s. So on lead guitar on this album, you got James Murphy, who played on Death, Spiritual Healing, Obituary, Cause of Death, more or less a premier extreme metal icon of lead guitar. So you got James Murphy. On bass, you got Steve DiGiorgio, who also was part of Death's revolving door of top talent. He played on Human, he played on Individual Thought Patterns, and also he played on Chuck Schuldiner extremely underrated side project, Control Denied, which, man, I really hope that second one someday sees the light of day. I believe it's called When Man and Machine Collide. Anyway, and on drums, Dave Lombardo of Slayer. Dave Lombardo on drums. Not to mention behind the boards, you have metal production extraordinaire Andy Sneap. So looking back, with this group of people involved, Testament couldn't miss. But it was the late 90s, so no one gave a shit. So there just wasn't this general cognizance of what could have been going on with The Gathering sessions. Well, that's where we come in. And just based on the incredible album opener here, Do Not Resuscitate, it's just difficult for me to understand how this record wasn't universally hailed as an instant classic the moment it came out. Just because the very first moments of the record are fucking exhilarating. The way that dramatic string intro just launches into this electrifying classic thrash riff, and the way that riff just feels so supercharged by the roaring bottom end heavy production here, you're just so instantly engrossed. The riffing in this first half of DNR in particular is such a fascinating case study, because the way the riffs are constructed isn't hugely different from what you would have heard on the New Order and to an extent Souls of Black. but the production makes such a monumental difference in the way this record just smacks you. So it's this weird dichotomy where compositionally, what's going on here would pretty much fit pretty neatly into the New Order, but sonically, The Gathering sounds nothing like Vintage Testament, and that's pretty clear right from the get-go here. And very quickly, the band make this distinction from their past crystal clear in another way, which is for me the best part of DNR and one of my favorite parts of this whole record, which is the extreme metal influenced bridge section here, with those amazing blast beats and just super dark, dismal, almost black metal tinged walls of big minor chords. And this moment on the first track of the record is a really forceful statement that things are just different on this record. Things are just different and get used to it. And because of DNR's ability to blend the trademark Testament thrash sound with this updated, modernized, increasingly extreme side of the band, it really is a flagship track for not only this album, but just this era of the band. And that combination that I just highlighted is actually super important. Because here's the thing, metal fans tend to frame The Gathering as Testament 2.0, just this complete reinvention and overhaul of the band's sound. But that's actually not true at all. That's not what's really going on here. What this record really is, when you see past the crushing production, which is very modern, is a 50-50 mix between the vintage Testament thrash sound and this so-called Testament 2.0. It is a very clear and defined mix between the old and the new. And that's what makes The Gathering so special, the way these two separate sides of the band coexist so spectacularly. And DNR is an example of that occurring within one song. When you really sit and listen to this record, think about it. The up-tempo second track, Down for Life, that's a perfect example. That is bare bones, Exit style, Overkill style riffing. That is Testament drawing directly from the origins of the band. And the fact that frontman Chuck Billy is also using his upper register quite a bit in parts of the song is another thing that dates it 15 years in the rear view. Not to mention the super direct, almost punk rock inspired lyrics about helping a friend in need who, in my interpretation, seems to be struggling with addiction. It's always been that last line of the song, I can't help my friend help himself, which has always made me think it's about addiction, but in reality it could be about any lifestyle or emotional struggle. But these type of lyrics are more derivative of thrash's origins in punk rock than anything else. And True Believer is another song that's firmly rooted in the band's past, with Chuck Billy's gruff singing voice on full display here, and when you combine that with the chunky mid-tempo riffs, it's very Ritual-esque. So on pieces of The Gathering, Testament are still very much in touch with their traditional thrash roots. And there are also pieces of The Gathering where the band take a fucking wrecking ball to that blueprint and make shit that's way meaner, way darker, way more extreme, way more cutting edge. Obviously, the aforementioned latter half of DNR falls into that category. Another one of my very favorite tracks on this album is a track called 3 Days in Darkness, which is anchored by the most menacing, just teeth-gritting halftime groove. It adds this whole other level of heaviness to the band's sound. And it provides a really nice contrast to the aforementioned traditional thrash songs. Which, speaking of groove, Sewn Shut Eyes is another super heavy and super modern moment on the record where you can kind of feel this new era being ushered in. Just listen to those super tight palm muted guitars and the synchronized double bass drums, and you can clearly hear how overwhelmingly influential a song like this was on a band like Lamb of God. Or Shadows Fall too, or many in the new wave of American heavy metal movement. And it's also important to note here that Chuck Billy is using mostly harsh vocals. Yeah, Lamb of God in particular pretty much just took this whole sound. So you have the old sounding songs, you have the new sounding songs, and then you have these songs in the middle that are kind of a mix of the two. Like Legions of the Dead is a great example. That song is an enthralling collision between thrash and death metal. And I would also describe the closer Fall of Sibildome that way. These songs are just like a battle royale between different eras of metal within one song. Also Riding the Snake, which the fucking highlight of that song is Steve DiGiorgio's bass runs in that bridge section. He gives it a really nice, noodly, death-inspired sound. And the huge factor in the band being able to pull off this diversity, this combination of the old, the new, and everything in between, is definitely Chuck Billy's vocals. Because as I've mentioned already, you hear Chuck Billy doing straight up roaring, harsh vocals on tracks like Sewn Shut Eyes, as well as Eyes of Wrath. And then you hear him doing his traditional late 80s approach on tracks like Down for Life and True Believer as well. A track like Allegiance is another example. And then there's a cut like Careful What You Wish For, which is another one of my favorites, where you hear him doing both styles at different parts of the song. And Dave Lombardo's drumming here is also a huge factor. He's a fucking monster. He elevates every track on here to the next level, whether it's making it groovier, whether it's making it more extreme, or whether it's giving it that classic feel that it needs. He is a huge part of why The Gathering is what it is. But of course, at the end of the day, I don't really need to sell you on this album at all because the music fucking sells itself. But again, what The Gathering did so well is it combined thrash metal with modern production and extreme metal elements as well, paving the way for not just many new wave of American heavy metal bands, but bands like Vector. The Gathering is no less than a modern thrash metal benchmark, by which I still judge new releases to this day, despite the fact that it's now over 20 years old. And yeah, key tracks for me on here would be DNR, Sewn Shut Eyes, 3 Days in Darkness, Eyes of Wrath, and Careful What You Wish For, which this set of tunes reveals my clear bias towards the so-called Testament 2.0, the heavier and more extreme version of the band. But I genuinely believe that the most important part of this record is the fact that it's a healthy blend between traditional Testament and the more high-octane Testament. I think if it were just one or the other, it would have been a lot more monotonous, and it certainly would not be the classic that it is. So give this thing a spin if you haven't yet, or I hope you really enjoyed revisiting it with me here. And as always, thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video and are not yet subscribed to my channel, please consider doing so by clicking right over here, as well as checking out any of the other rock or metal related content that I publish here on a weekly basis. Really appreciate you watching, liking, disliking, commenting, interacting in any fashion. Twitter, Instagram handle @RyanPanMusic. Again, thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you soon.